Logan Hastings sat at his usual corner table in the dim, luxurious restaurant, a half-empty glass of whiskey resting against his fingers. It was Valentine's Day, a holiday that had never meant much to him. For most, it was a night of candlelight and whispered affection. For Logan, it was just another date on a calendar already jammed with meetings and contracts. His empire didn't pause for sentiment. Business was his comfort, control was his sanctuary, and routine was his religion. He had learned long ago that emotions only serve to complicate things. But there was something about this evening that unsettled him, something that felt jagged around the edges. Maybe it was the exaggerated smiles on the faces of the couples surrounding him. Maybe it was the reminder that he was, once again, alone. He took another sip of his drink, letting the warmth burn its way down his throat, dulling whatever it was gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. And then he saw her. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, there she was, Sophie. She was standing near the entrance of the restaurant, speaking quietly to the host. Time hadn't changed her much. Her chestnut hair still framed her face in soft waves, and she still moved with the grace that had first drawn him in all those years ago. He hadn't seen her in 3 years, not since they'd ended things in a silence that was more painful than any shouting match could have been. He had walked away, believing that was the end of it, and it should have been. But then his gaze shifted, and the world tilted. The little boy standing beside her clutched her hand, his small fingers tangled in hers as he gazed curiously around the room. Logan's pulse stalled. There was something about the boy's face, the dark, thoughtful eyes, the way his expression softened when he looked up at Sophie, the small crease between his brows as he concentrated on something invisible. He knew that face. Or, at least, he knew versions of it. He'd seen it in photographs of himself as a boy. He saw it in the mirror every morning. Logan couldn't breathe. His grip tightened around the glass, ice shifting sharply against the crystal. His heart was thundering in his chest as if trying to punch its way out. That was his son. There was no doubt in his mind. He could see it, feel it, know it. But why hadn't he known before this moment? Sophie didn't notice him at first. She was focused on the boy, helping him settle into his chair and smoothing down his collar as she spoke softly to him. Her attention was all his, her expression gentle in a way that twisted something sharp and unfamiliar inside Logan. He sat frozen, watching them from across the room. Every calculated move he had ever made suddenly seemed useless, every carefully built wall in his life now reduced to rubble. He needed answers. No, he needed the truth. And for the first time in his life, he had no plan for how to get it. He set his glass down slowly, his hand steady even though he felt anything but. Then he stood. His legs moved on autopilot as he crossed the restaurant, each step heavy with a mixture of dread and determination. Sophie didn't look up until he was only a few feet away. Their eyes met and he saw it immediately, recognition, and something more. Something that made his gut twist, guilt. She didn't speak. Not at first. Her gaze flickered between him and the boy, who remained oblivious, poking at a small pile of pasta on his plate. Logan's throat was dry, but his voice was solid when he finally forced it out. Is he mine? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Sophie's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out, and she didn't need to say a word. Logan already knew the answer. Still, he waited. Sophie's shoulders seemed to sag, a long breath escaping her as she lowered her gaze to her hands. She folded her napkin slowly, fingers trembling just enough for him to notice. When she finally looked back up at him, there was no anger in her expression, only regret. Not here, she said quietly. Logan nodded. He understood. Not because he wanted to make things easier for her, but because he didn't want his son, to hear the conversation that was about to unfold. Sophie stood and leaned close to the boy. Caleb, she murmured. Sweetheart, can you stay here with Miss Emily for a little bit? Mommy needs to talk to someone. The boy nodded without question, his gaze following Sophie for a moment before turning back to his plate. Logan watched him carefully. Caleb. His son's name was Caleb. He followed Sophie to the far side of the restaurant, near the entrance where the hum of voices was quieter and the light was softer. She stopped, arms crossed tightly over her chest, shielding herself with a barrier he wasn't sure he could break through. Is he mine? Logan repeated, his voice low, but sharper now. She took a moment, her lips pressing into a tight line before she nodded. "Wes," she said softly. The word was a punch to his chest, stealing the air from his lungs. Even though he'd suspected, hearing it aloud stripped away whatever illusions he had left. "You kept him from me," Logan said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact, cold and heavy in his mouth. Sophie's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I did what I thought was best," she said quietly. "For who?" His jaw clenched, the fire rising in his chest. "You didn't think I had a right to know." "I was protecting him," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "And maybe protecting you too." Logan shook his head, disbelief crashing over him. "Protecting me from what?" "From yourself," Sophie said. "From the life you were living. You were building an empire, Logan. You were obsessed. You didn't have room for anything else." Logan wanted to deny it, wanted to say she was wrong, but deep down, he knew she wasn't. 3 years ago, he was a different man. He would have seen fatherhood as a responsibility, not a gift. "You should have told me," he said, his voice rougher now. "I know," Sophie said softly, "and I'm sorry." They stood there in silence for a moment. Logan's mind was racing. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he wanted to ask. But only one thing mattered now. "I want to know him," he said. "I want to know my son." Sophie studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, and just like that, the ground beneath Logan Hastings shifted again. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to walk away. The next morning, Logan stood in front of his mirror, straightening the cuffs of his shirt with a precision that had once defined him. The reflection that stared back wasn't the same man who had walked into that restaurant last night. His jaw was tighter, his eyes darker, but it wasn't anger that weighed them down. It was something more complicated, something heavier. He had spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, playing out every conversation, every missed moment, every possibility of what came next. He had a son, a little boy named Caleb. A life had existed without him for 3 years. And no matter how many times he told himself that he'd been wronged, he couldn't ignore what Sophie had said. The version of himself she had walked away from back then hadn't been a man ready to be a father. But he was ready now. Or at least he had to be. His phone vibrated on the counter. Sophie. Her text was short. "Come by the park at noon." No pleasantries. No hesitation. It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. She needed to see if he would show up. If he could be trusted to show up. Logan pocketed his phone and grabbed his keys, ignoring the tightness in his chest as he stepped out of his apartment. The drive across town felt longer than it should have. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but that had never stopped him before. When he arrived at the park, he spotted them instantly. Sophie sat on a bench near the swings, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, watching Caleb with a quiet focus. Caleb was on the slide, his small hands gripping the rails as he climbed with determination. Logan stood there for a moment, watching them from a distance. Caleb was smaller than he had imagined, but there was a strength in him, an energy that was unmistakable. He didn't hesitate as he climbed to the top and pushed himself down the slide with a grin that took Logan's breath away. He'd missed 3 years of moments like this, but he wouldn't miss any more. Sophie saw him first. Her gaze found his, unreadable as always. She gave him a nod, just enough to tell him it was okay to come closer. He walked over slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached them, Caleb was already at the bottom of the slide, brushing sand off his jeans. He looked up, those dark eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Logan. Logan crouched down to his level, careful not to crowd him. Logan said, his voice softer than he expected. "We met yesterday. Remember me?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, as if weighing his options, then finally gave a small nod. Logan let out a quiet breath. Wasn't much, but it was something. "I thought maybe we could play together," Logan offered. "If you want." Caleb glanced at Sophie. She didn't say anything. She just smiled and gave him a little nod of encouragement. After a moment, Caleb turned back to Logan and held out his hand. In it was a small, battered toy car. Logan took carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Logan asked. Caleb nodded. "Men too," Logan said, and it wasn't a lie. He had spent years collecting them. Sleek, fast machines that symbolized success. But holding this small plastic car now, he realized there was more to it than speed or power. It was about sharing something, being part of something. For the next hour, they played. Logan chased Caleb through the sand, pushing him gently on the swings, and holding his hand as they climbed the jungle gym. Caleb didn't say much, but he smiled more, and that was enough. Sophie watched them quietly from the bench, arms folded loosely across her chest. She wasn't interfering, but she wasn't distant either. She was watching, measuring, waiting to see if Logan would falter. When Caleb finally got tired and climbed onto the bench beside his mother, Logan sat down next to them, his breathing a little heavier than usual. "He's fast," Logan said, wiping the sweat from his brow. Sophie smiled faintly. "He likes to run," she said. Caleb leaned against her, yawning. "He's going to crash hard in about 5 minutes," Sophie added, brushing Caleb's curls away from his forehead. Logan studied them, the quiet closeness between them. It was natural, effortless. Something he wanted to be a part of, but something he knew he would have to earn. "I want to be here," Logan said quietly. Sophie turned her gaze toward him, her expression careful. "It's not about wanting," she said. "It's about showing up. Consistently." "I will," Logan promised. And he meant it. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Caleb as he drifted into sleep, his head resting against Sophie's side. Logan's gaze dropped to the little boy's face, memorizing every feature, every small gesture. He was his. There was no denying it. And that realization was both terrifying and profound. Later, as they stood by Sophie's car, she buckled Caleb into his seat, moving with a mother's practiced efficiency. Logan watched, feeling a strange etch in his chest. He had missed so much. But he was here now. Sophie closed the door quietly and turned to him. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. Logan nodded. "I'll be here." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." She climbed into the driver's seat and started the car. As she pulled away, Logan stood there, watching them disappear down the street. And for the first time in years, he realized he wasn't thinking about meetings or deadlines. He was thinking about tomorrow. And the day after that, Logan spent the evening preparing, not for a board meeting, not for a merger, but for a day at the park with his son. He ordered books on parenting, made a mental list of activities Caleb might enjoy, and even found himself practicing how to tie a proper shoelace on one of his old sneakers, just in case Caleb needed help. It was ridiculous, it was unlike him, and it was exactly what he needed to do. When the morning came, he was already at the park, waiting. This time, when Sophie arrived with Caleb, there was less tension in her expression. Caleb ran ahead, holding his favorite toy car in one hand. "Logan," he called out. Not Daddy. Not yet, but it was his name, and it was a start. Logan crouched down, catching Caleb in a gentle hug before pulling back to meet his son's gaze. "Ready to race?" Logan asked, holding up a matching toy car he'd bought the night before. Caleb's grin was answer enough. They spent the morning in a world of make-believe racetracks and imaginary pit stops. Sophie sat nearby reading a book, but Logan knew she was listening, watching, and he was okay with that. He wanted her to see. He wanted her to know he was here to stay. When Caleb finally grew tired and climbed into his mother's lap, Logan sat beside them, feeling something settle deep inside his chest. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't sure he ever would be. But he was trying. And for now, that was enough. Logan looked at Sophie, and for the first time since they'd parted ways, she smiled at him. Not a guarded smile. Not a polite one. A real one. And in that moment he knew. He was home. Logan found himself waiting at the same park bench every morning, an hour earlier than he needed to be there. It had become a routine. This quiet time before Sophie and Caleb arrived. He'd never understood the appeal of watching a sunrise, but now he did. The light came in slow, inch by inch, changing the color of the sky from deep gray to soft gold. It was a reminder that some things didn't rush. They unfolded in their own time. And that was how Caleb was learning to let him in, inch by inch. The third week of their new arrangement brought small shifts. Caleb no longer waited for permission to run into Logan's arms when he saw him. He called him Logan, sometimes low, but there was a softness to his tone that hadn't been there in the beginning. When Logan pushed him on the swings, Caleb laughed loudly enough that other parents turned to look, and Logan let himself laugh with him. Loud, unfiltered, honest. It was a sound he hadn't made in years, and he didn't care who heard it. Sophie watched everything. She was cautious, yes, but she was no longer distant. She didn't hover anymore. Some days, she sat on the bench with her coffee and watched Logan, Caleb play tag across the grass. Other days, she walked with them, close enough that her shoulder brushed against Logan's arm when Caleb insisted they both hold his hands as he swung between them. One chilly afternoon, as they sat beneath a tree and Caleb napped across Logan's lap, Sophie spoke the question that had been hanging in the air between them for weeks. What changed you? Logan looked up from Caleb's sleeping face, his fingers still resting gently on his son's back. Sophie wasn't looking at him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, but she was listening, waiting, and he owed her the truth. I got tired, Logan said quietly. Tired of pretending that success meant anything when I had no one to share it with. Tired of waking up in the morning and not knowing what I was doing it all for. He glanced down at Caleb, who shifted slightly in his sleep but stayed peaceful. And then I saw him. That first night in the restaurant. I knew he was mine. Sophie's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. I've never been more scared in my life, Logan admitted. And I've negotiated billion-dollar deals with people who would bankrupt me if they could. Sophie gave a soft, almost sad laugh. I didn't know if you'd come after us. I didn't either, he said honestly. 3 years ago, I wouldn't have. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't think I was capable of this. Of being this. She finally looked at him, her eyes softer than he'd seen in a long time. You're proving me wrong. He held her gaze. I'm proving myself wrong. They didn't speak again for a while. Caleb stirred and mumbled something about dinosaurs before falling back asleep. Logan smiled at the sound, at the fact that his son trusted him enough to sleep on him like this. It was a small thing, but it felt enormous. The next time they met at the park, Sophie handed him Caleb's overnight bag without a word. Logan stared at it, then at her. Are you sure? He asked. She hesitated. I wouldn't be handing it to you if I wasn't. Logan took the bag carefully, as if it were made of glass. Caleb was already bouncing by the car, excited about the sleepover they'd planned all week. Logan didn't let himself think too hard about it as he strapped his son into the back seat and drove them to his apartment. The penthouse felt different with Caleb in it. Logan had never realized how empty it had been until he watched his son race across the open floor plan, skidding in socks and leaving small handprints on his spotless windows. He didn't care about the mess. For once, he welcomed it. They ate dinner together, Caleb sitting in one of the sleek dining chairs that looked far too big for him. Logan made spaghetti, burning the sauce and laughing when Caleb made a face at the taste. They ordered pizza instead, Caleb declaring it the best dinner ever as he swung his legs beneath the table. Afterward, they built a fort in the living room with expensive linens and cush cushions that had never been used for anything other than decoration. Logan lay beside his son in the dim glow of a flashlight, listening as Caleb explained the intricate family tree of his stuffed animals. When Caleb finally drifted off, his small hand wrapped around Logan's finger, Logan stayed there, staring at the ceiling of their makeshift fortress. He could have stayed there forever. At some point, he texted Sophie. A single photo, Caleb asleep under the blankets, the stuffed dinosaur tucked under his chin. He's okay, Logan typed. We're okay. Sophie's reply came back almost immediately. I know. The next morning, Logan made pancakes from a box mix. Caleb covered his in syrup and powdered sugar, declaring them almost as good as Mommy's. Logan took it as a win. After breakfast, they sat on the couch and watched cartoons. Logan wasn't sure when he fell asleep, but when he woke, Caleb was curled into his side, breathing softly. He didn't move, just stayed there, memorizing every second. Later that afternoon, when Sophie came to pick Caleb up, Logan felt something twist in his chest. It wasn't sadness, it was longing. He wanted more days like this, more mornings, more pancake breakfasts and cartoons and sleepy cuddles on the couch. Sophie noticed. She always did. Next weekend, she said. Same plan. Logan ruddy. As they drove away, Logan stood at the window, watching until their car was out of sight. His apartment was quiet again, but not empty. Not an evening. Logan pulled out his calendar. He cleared meetings, pushed back calls. He made room. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to. Because he was a father now, And for the first time in his life, that was the title that mattered. The days turned into weeks, and soon those weekend visits became as normal as Logan's morning coffee. Caleb's things took up space in Logan's once pristine apartment. His favorite books stacked on the coffee table, tiny sneakers abandoned by the front door, drawings taped onto the fridge with magnets shaped like animals. And Logan wouldn't have changed a single thing about it. Every corner of his world that once echoed with silence now carried Caleb's laughter, his questions, his stories about dragons and spaceships, and whatever his imagination decided was important that day. Logan learned how to pack a proper lunchbox. He figured out which nightlight helped Caleb fall asleep faster. He knew which lullaby Sophie sang to him on nights when he was scared of storms, and he sang it quietly in his deep, unsure voice on the nights Caleb stayed with him. Sometimes Caleb giggled because Logan was hopelessly off key, but he never asked him to stop. One Friday evening, Caleb was at his side as Logan finished his last video call of the day. The boy had built a fortress under Logan's desk, pretending to be an undercover spy as Logan negotiated terms on a contract that would seal the biggest deal of his quarter. When the call ended, Logan leaned down to peek under the desk, finding Caleb sitting cross-legged with a notepad, scribbling something. "What are you working on down there, partner?" Logan asked. Caleb grinned, holding up the paper. It was a drawing of two stick figures holding hands. One was taller, wearing a suit, and the other had curly hair. Logan knew immediately who they were. "That's me," Caleb said proudly, pointing to the smaller figure. Logan's throat tightened. "And me." Caleb nodded, his grin wide. "You're my daddy." Logan reached out and took the drawing with careful hands, like it was more valuable than anything he had ever closed a deal on. "I'll keep it on my desk," he said. "Best thing I've ever gotten." Caleb beamed, satisfied, and ducked back under the desk to continue his game. Logan sat back in his chair, staring at the picture for a long moment before placing it in a frame. No multi-million-dollar contract had ever made him feel this way. Saturday morning, Logan and Caleb were in the kitchen, working on their pancakes. Logan had improved since his first attempt, though Caleb was the true culinary master, insisting on adding blueberries in the shape of a smiley face. They laughed when the batter ran together, creating a lopsided grin. Sophie arrived just as they were sitting down to eat. She'd come early, expecting to take Caleb for the day, but Logan caught her watching them through the kitchen window before she knocked. He waved her inside. "You sure you don't want some?" Logan asked as he flipped another pancake onto the plate. Sophie hesitated in the doorway. "I should probably stay," Caleb said before she could finish. "Daddy made breakfast." Sophie smiled, the hesitation melting away. She hung her bag on the back of a chair and sat down. "All right," she agreed. "But only because I hear he's getting better at this." They ate together like they'd done it 100 times before. Caleb chattering about his newest dinosaur toy while Logan and Sophie listened. Logan poured Sophie's coffee without asking how she took it because he already knew. After breakfast, they all ended up in the living room, Caleb pulling them both into a game of building towers out of blocks. Logan's hands were steady as he stacked the pieces, but it was Sophie's laughter that made him pause. He hadn't heard it like that in years. It was light, unguarded. She caught him looking at her and smiled. "You're good at this," she said softly, as Caleb leaned against Logan's side, completely focused on his tower. Logan shrugged, but his heart pounded. "I'm trying," and he was. Every day. By late afternoon, Sophie stood at the door, ready to leave with Caleb. Logan handed her the overnight bag with Caleb's pajamas neatly folded inside. As he crouched to say goodbye, Caleb surprised him by throwing his arms around his neck. "I love you, Daddy," Caleb whispered. Logan froze for a moment before pulling him close. "I love you too, buddy," he said, and meant it in a way that shook him to his core. When the door closed behind them, Logan stood in the silence for a long time. But it didn't feel empty anymore. A few days later, Logan was in his office when his assistant came in with an unexpected visitor. Sophie. She stood there, holding a folder close to her chest, her face serious but calm. "I need to talk to you," she said. Logan dismissed his meeting and cleared the room without hesitation. When the door shut behind them, he motioned to the chair across from his desk. "What's going on?" he asked. She handed him the folder. It's Caleb's school application. Logan opened it, reading through the pages. His heart stumbled at the line listing him as Caleb's father. "You're putting me on this?" he asked, glancing up. "You're his father," she said. "You're here. You've earned this." For Logan, it wasn't just paperwork. It was acknowledgement, a validation of everything he had fought for since the moment he saw Caleb in that restaurant. He signed the papers without hesitation. Afterwards, they walked out together. Sophie glanced at him as they stood by the elevator. "You've changed," she said quietly. Logan gave her a faint smile. "I hope so." They stood in silence until the elevator doors opened. She stepped inside but turned before they closed. "Dinner Friday, with Caleb, at our place." Logan's smile widened. "I'll be there," and he was. Friday night, Logan arrived with a bag of groceries and helped Sophie cook dinner while Caleb colored at the table. They ate together, laughed together, and when it was time for Caleb's bedtime story, Logan was the one who read it. After Caleb was asleep, Sophie walked him to the door. They stood there for a moment, neither one wanting to be the first to speak. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" he asked. "For being here," she said. "For not giving up." "Couldn't," he said softly. "I won't." She nodded, and for the first time in years, she leaned in and kissed his cheek. It was a simple gesture, but it made Logan feel more than anything ever had. He left with the promise of tomorrow. Logan no longer counted success in profits or deals. He counted it in bedtime stories, shared dinners, and the sound of his son's laughter filling the room. And for the first time, he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Logan never thought he'd look forward to weekends with the same anticipation he used to reserve for closing high-stakes deals. But Friday nights had become something different now. They weren't just 2 days off from work. They were 2 days where Caleb was his entire world. He found himself measuring time by them, counting down the hours until he could pick his son up, planning small adventures, wondering which books they'd read before bedtime, or which games Caleb would want to play. It was late afternoon, and Logan stood outside Sophie's apartment building. He rang the buzzer and waited, but the door opened before he could say anything. Caleb burst out, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. His face lit up with excitement. Logan bent down, catching him in a hug as the boy flung himself into his arms without hesitation. "You're early," Caleb said, breathless. "I couldn't wait," Logan admitted, ruffling his curls. "You ready for our adventure?" Caleb nodded, already trying to drag him toward the car. Sophie stood in the doorway, smiling softly as she watched them. "Be careful," she called out. Logan turned, giving her a reassuring look. "Always." They drove to the planetarium that afternoon. Caleb was obsessed with stars lately, and Logan had bought tickets weeks in advance for their special exhibit. When they arrived, Caleb practically ran inside, tugging Logan along, his small fingers wrapped tightly around his. Underneath the dark dumb ceiling, as constellations swirled above them, Logan watched his son's eyes widen in awe. Caleb leaned in close to whisper, "That one's Orion. He's a hunter." But Logan smiled. "You've been studying." Caleb grinned proudly. "Mama reads me books. She says the stars are old, like older than you." Logan chuckled under his breath. "That's pretty old." Afterwards, they sat on a bench outside, eating ice cream while Caleb swung his legs, his feet still too short to reach the ground. Logan listened as Caleb told him stories about the planets, stories that he probably made up, blending fact with his vivid imagination. Logan didn't correct him. He just listened, and that felt like enough. Later that evening, back at Logan's apartment, Caleb yawned as Logan helped him into pajamas covered in tiny rockets and stars. Logan tucked him into bed, sitting beside him with the same book they read most nights now. Caleb's eyelids drooped as Logan's voice rumbled softly, his small hand resting against Logan's wrist, holding on until he finally fell asleep. Logan didn't leave right away. He sat there for a while, watching him breathe. The rise and fall of his son's chest was steady and peaceful. It was a quiet rhythm that grounded him in a way nothing else could. He stood, careful not to make a sound, and walked back into the living room. His phone buzzed with work emails, but he ignored them. Instead, he made tea and sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. Sophie's message came through not long after. "How's he doing?" "Sleeping like a rock," Logan replied. "Thank you. For everything." Logan read the words more than once before typing back. I should have been here from the start. You're here now. That's what matters. He stared at her reply until the screen dimmed, and for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The next morning, Logan and Caleb made pancakes together. Or rather, Caleb dumped handfuls of chocolate chips into the batter, while Logan tried to keep things from spilling all over the counter. The kitchen was a mess by the time they finished, but Caleb's giggles made it worth it. Sophie arrived late in the afternoon to pick him up. She stepped inside, taking the disaster zone that was now Logan's kitchen. Her eyes widened. What happened here? Pancake science, Caleb said proudly. Sophie shook her head, smiling, as she helped Caleb with his backpack. Logan watched them from across the room, something twisting in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was regret over what he had missed or gratitude for what he still had. Maybe both. Before they left, Sophie lingered by the door. He loves this, she said softly, being with you. I love it too, Logan replied, his voice quieter than usual. Thank you for giving me this. Sophie nodded. See you Monday. And when they were gone, the apartment felt empty again, but it was a different kind of emptiness, not loneliness, just waiting. The weeks passed, and soon Logan found himself part of routines he never thought he'd have. School drop-offs, playdates, birthday parties. He sat through Caleb's first dance recital, even though his son mostly stood there looking confused until the music ended. He didn't care. He clapped the loudest. One evening, Sophie invited him to dinner, not for Caleb, but for them. She cooked pasta, and they talked about everything and nothing. It wasn't like it had been before. It was better. There was honesty now, respect, and something else that neither of them dared name just yet. As they cleaned up, Sophie stood beside him, drying dishes while he washed. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. You're different. Logan rinsed a plate and handed it to her. I had to be. I think I like this version of you. He paused, water dripping from his fingers. I like him too. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. They had both made mistakes. But they had found their way back. Not to what they were, but to something new. Something stronger. When Logan left that night, Sophie walked him to the door. He hesitated, then leaned in and kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, they both just stood there at Sophie. Good night, Logan. He drove home in silence, but his mind was full. Not with strategies or business plans, but with the quiet hope that maybe this time, he could get it right. Logan sat quietly in the conference room of Hastings International, looking over a set of reports he would normally read with complete focus. But his mind wasn't on quarterly projections or potential mergers. It was on a little boy sitting in a kindergarten classroom across town, probably drawing spaceships or practicing writing his name. His name. Caleb Hastings. He'd signed the school papers himself this time. Not as an emergency contact. Not as a guest in his son's life, as his father. And it meant more than any signature he'd ever scrawled on a contract. The sharp knock on the glass door pulled him back. His assistant stepped inside with a tablet in hand but paused when she saw his distracted expression. Everything okay, Mr. Hastings? He blinked once, then nodded. Yeah, fine. And for the first time, he meant it. He wrapped up early that day, earlier than he ever would have thought possible a year ago. He no longer cared if his staff whispered about how he left at 4 in the afternoon or scheduled meetings around school events. He was already running late to pick Caleb up from his first swimming lesson. By the time he got to the pool, Caleb was bundled up in his towel. Cheeks flushed, wet hair stuck to his forehead. He ran the moment he saw Logan launching into his arms. Logan caught him with practiced ease. You see me dive? Caleb asked breathlessly. Logan smiled, tucking him in closer. I did. Best dive I've ever seen. They got ice cream on the way home, even though Sophie would tease them both about it later. She was waiting at Logan's place when they arrived, already smiling when Caleb bounced in with a chocolate-smeared grin. I swear, Logan, she said as she wiped Caleb's face, you're going to spoil him. Logan just shrugged, hanging up his jacket. That's the plan. That night, when Caleb was asleep and they stood quietly in the living room, Sophie turned toward him. You've changed, she said again, but it wasn't the same as before. There was a softness to it, a weight behind the words. Logan, no. I like it, she said quietly. I like us. He stepped closer, brushing his fingers against hers. Men too. And when she leaned in and kissed him, slow, familiar, and knew all at once. Logan knew he was home. He kissed her back, steady and certain. This time there was no fear, no hesitation. They didn't rush things. They didn't need to. Every weekend with Caleb, every quiet evening after bedtime stories, every morning where Sophie stayed for coffee, they built something together. Something that mattered. Something that wasn't just about second chances, but about creating something better from the pieces they still had. One afternoon, months later, Logan sat on a bench at the park while Caleb climbed the jungle gym with a group of kids. Sophie sat beside him, her hand resting casually on his thigh. They watched Caleb laugh, fearless and bright as he swung from the bars. "You ever think we'd be here?" Sophie asked softly. Logan shook his head. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone. That I'd made too many mistakes." "You didn't." "I did," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "But I got lucky. I found my way back." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We found our way." And he smiled. Because they had. The next year, when Caleb stood on the stage at his school's spring concert, he waved first at Sophie, and then at Logan. Logan stood in the aisle, his phone forgotten in his pocket, just watching. Caleb's grin stretched wide when he saw him there. Logan waved back. They went to dinner afterwards. Caleb bouncing in his seat as he talked about singing in stage lights and how he hadn't been scared at all. "I wasn't nervous," he insisted. Logan chuckled, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "I was. You did great." Sophie watched them both, her eyes warm. Later that night, back at Logan's apartment. No, their apartment now, he tucked Caleb in, smoothing the blanket over his small form. "Love you, Daddy," Caleb whispered. "I love you too," Logan said, his throat thick. He stayed a moment longer, watching his son sleep, before turning out the light. When he stepped back into the living room, Sophie was waiting for him. He pulled her in close, resting his forehead against hers. "Not going anywhere," he whispered. "I know." She stayed. Every morning. Every night. Through tantrums and lost teeth, through birthdays and skinned knees. He showed up. He stayed. And that was everything. Logan Hastings, the man who had once built an empire thinking that was enough, had found something better. A family. And this time, he held on with both hands.